So thank you very much for coming, and I'm just going to talk about this book for probably about 20 minutes, and then we can have a conversation about it. So I'm really happy to take questions. All right, so as you might be able to tell, this is a nonfiction graphic novel. If you are unfamiliar with the genre, well, let me put it this way. So you know how most movies are fiction, but some are documentaries? Similarly, most comic books are fiction, but some are nonfiction. I was really inspired by a series called The Cartoon History of the Universe. It's a 5-volume history of everything from the Big Bang up to the Iraq War. It's by a guy named Larry Gonick. And it's wonderful, and not just because it's entertaining, but it's also accurate. So whenever there's a period of history I know well, I open up that part of the book and say, wow, all the facts are correct, but it's also very visually pleasing, and it's funny, and it's memorable. Right, so that inspired me. So if I could do something like that, wouldn't it be so great if I could break out of just doing regular books and get to be part of this? But there is the problem that I cannot draw. So that's somewhat of an impediment, but not a full impediment. So of course, there's a division of labor here, and there are a lot of great graphic novelists who don't draw. So like if you know Alan Moore's The Watchmen, he didn't draw that, right? Rather, he got another guy, so Dave Gibbons. All right, actually, I just realized there's one thing I need to do. Let's see, I've been having mild back pain, and I don't want to leave here today with severe back pain, so I'm going to put on my back brace. All right, but it's a sign I'm getting better that I forgot that I needed it. Okay, all right, right there. Okay, good. All right, so that is the project here. The artist is my #1 choice in the world, Zach Weinersmith. And the fact that I was able to get him is no small thanks to IHS, which did provide some money in order to attract him, because whereas I could afford to work on this and then see whether I could ever get anyone to buy it, but Zach, on the other hand, his livelihood is doing this. He doesn't have a tenured professorial position anywhere of comic books, so therefore the money was important in getting him to do it. All right, so let me just start with 2 frames of immigration, and this really does underlie the entire book. So there is one view of immigration that I think is overwhelmingly predominant among Americans, regardless of their views on immigration policy. And I call this the immigration as charity frame. All right, and it comes like this. All right, so of course, Albert Einstein, we want him on our team, and Sergey Brin, and a few other superstars. You actually want them out of national self-interest to be Americans, right? So they can build your nuclear weapons and your rockets and create Google and that kind of thing. All right, so almost everyone admit there's a few superstar immigrants where they actually are valuable to get. And what do we want to do? We want to poach them from other countries. So we go and we have a little raid and we get their talent, and that is all in our interest. But then there's the problem that there's only a few people like Albert Einstein and Sergey Brin, so what are we to think of everybody else? And I say that in the standard view of immigration, the other immigrants are not actually useful to have, right? They are, if not a burden, at least they're more mouths to feed, or they're like, what's so good about them? Fine, they go and work as a janitor, but who needs that? Another person who works in an office, we got plenty of those. There's no point in having such people, all right? So it says that after we've admitted the superstars out of self-interest, then all the other people, we're basically letting them in because we're nice. We're letting them in as an act of charity. So for the standard view, immigration is a lot like foreign aid, right? It's a sacrifice that we make in order to go and help some other desperate people, but we're not going to go and put that much into it because it is a burden upon us, all right? And once you accept this view, which again I think that not only opponents of immigration have, but also most American advocates of immigration will have, then there are a bunch of obvious questions that come to mind. So one of them is, how much charity can we afford? How much charity can we afford? We can't just let in 1 billion dependents into the US. That is just an excessive burden. We can't afford to do that, right? So just like, about like a crazy cat lady who lets raise 1,000 cats in her house, but generally considered unwise to be that cat lady, right? So maybe you can go and take in 1 or 2 stray cats and you're nice, but you can't just keep taking in the stray cats, right? It's just too much of a burden. All right, so that is a common view of immigrants. All right, fine, we can go and take in a few desperate war orphans, but come on, we're not going to fill the country up with the orphans. Right. Then second question, can't someone else do it? Why can't Germany take them or Canada? Why does it have to be us that takes these immigrants? All right, another very common question that people don't voice, at least they're asking themselves. And then finally, the one that people are very happy to say loudly is, look, are there any needy Americans left? Is there any native-born American citizen who needs our help? Are we all doing well right now? No? Well, then why are we going and helping these strangers? Why are we helping these strangers? Shouldn't we take care of our own people first? And again, as long as you think of immigration as charity, this is a very natural question with great rhetorical force. Saying, look, if your own kids were hungry, you wouldn't go and start adopting orphans. You would get your own house in order. Right? And similarly, if we've got an opioid crisis in West Virginia, we don't need to be taking in refugees or letting in low-skilled immigrants. We need to go and solve that problem. And then once 100% of Americans are doing well, then maybe we can revisit the issue. Right? And when will 100% of all Americans be doing well? What's the expected date for that to occur? Right? So there's this old interview with Castro where the interviewer says, "So Castro, when will there be free elections here in Cuba?" And then Castro says, "There will be free elections when every child is fed, when every child is educated, when everyone has wonderful health care." And he went on and on. And then commentator says, "In other words, never." All right. Okay, so that's the standard frame. And here you're able to read the panels from where you are. Let's see. So those of you there, so some of you can. So anyway, you'll notice there is a frame around this because that is making concrete the metaphor of a frame. So it goes frame 1.0. And remember, 1.0 is always bad, right? You never want 1.0. All right. But yes, so here we have the first panel. I've got me, Uncle Sam, and some foreigners warming their hands over a metal drum with some fire coming out of it. Saying, in the conventional frame, allowing immigration is an act of national charity. Unless the immigrant is a brain surgeon, rocket scientist, or supermodel, we're doing a favor out of the kindness of our hearts, which quickly raises two awkward questions. How many immigrants can we afford to take? And shouldn't we take care of our own people first? All right. And then we come to my alternative frame, which is really what underlies the entire book. And this is frame 2.0. And being 2.0 is therefore better, right? So sometimes 3.0 is worse than 2.0, but 2.0 is always better than 1.0, correct? Yes, right, so. All right, and I call this the frame of immigration as justice and abundance. So I wrote this book not just to make people like immigrants more or to be more compassionate. Those are sub-goals, but a lot of books do that. I wanted to write a book that would challenge this conventional frame and just say the way that people think about immigration, including people who like immigration, is wrong. It is a deeply misleading frame, and there is another way that you should be thinking about it. All right. So first of all, morally, is allowing immigrants in charity? Is allowing immigrants in charity? I say that it is not. Rather, I say there is a presumptive human right to rent a place from a willing landlord and take a job from a willing employer. So yes, this is the big libertarian point of the book, but it's also one where I think of it as a common sense point. Right? So is it an act of charity to refrain from slashing the tires of your competitor for a job? Right? So you and your neighbor are both going to go to try to interview for a job, and you know that your neighbor has the interview right before you, so you're thinking, hey, if I slash his tires, he will not make the interview on time, and then I'm more likely to get the job. All right, so does it count as an act of charity to not slash his tires? All right, and no, it is not an act of charity to refrain from slashing tires. It is basic minimal decency to not slash his tires. And even though there's a competition between you, he has every right to go and try to get that job because you don't own that job, right? It is up to the employer to make an offer to the person that he wants. And if he decides that he wants to make it to your neighbor rather than you, it does not show that you were engaged in some kind of philanthropy when you did not try to stop him from doing it, right? So now, how many of you have read or heard of Mike Huemer's Problem of Political Authority? Right? So if you haven't, you totally should. It is the best work of libertarian political philosophy ever written. I'll vouch for that, and I've read a lot. And this is the one that I am happy to give to non-libertarians and say, it may not convince you, but it should convince you. And when you read it, you will not feel like you're listening to some dogmatic person who is just engaged in circular reasoning. He's actually trying to go and meet you where you stand. Right? And similarly here. Right? So if there is a foreign-born person who would like to get a job, and there is a native-born employer who would like to hire him, then how is it anything other than simple justice to get out of the way? All right, now that, of course, is a moral point, and you might say, yes, sounds very good, but unfortunately, we got to pay the bills, and we just can't afford to act in this high-minded way. And of course, similarly, if you're slashing the tires, you might say, I was kind of desperate here, so, if I didn't get the job, I was going to be out on the street, so I slashed the tires. Maybe it wasn't very nice, but yeah, I did it anyway. Okay. The other thing that I say, and this is where my social scientist hat, which is my main hat, comes through, as I say, we can easily afford to respect this right. We can easily afford to respect the right of foreigners and natives to transact business because labor mobility vastly enriches not only the immigrant, but the world. All right, we can already see this domestically, where if there's someone who is in a dying town in Nebraska, what is the most they can contribute to the world economy in that town? Maybe they can go and work in a diner or something like that. All right. Now, what would happen? What happens if they go and move to, say, to a place in the country where economic opportunities are better? They get a much better job, where they are able to be part of the modern world. And when they do this, of course, they enrich themselves. But they don't only enrich themselves. When you move to a job that pays more and you produce more, you are thereby also offering those new products and those more valuable products to customers, and they benefit from that. Right? And that is definitely true within a country. If you had the talent to be a nuclear physicist and you are just staying behind in a farm town, right, what are you doing for the world? You're not doing very much. All right, now why exactly is it that immigration is so fantastic for the production of the world? Right, and this is where we have, let's see, actually, let me just go back. So the panel, yes, so here you have me with a funhouse mirror saying the conventional frame is morally obtuse and factually incorrect. So respecting people's right to live and work where they like is not alms, but the simple justice that we owe to every fellow human being. And that is the libertarian sermon part. Right, and then and simple justice is dirt cheap because open borders will unlock unprecedented abundance by freeing global labor markets. So if any of you guys know Richard Scarry's book, What Do People Do All Day? Know this book? So this panel is actually an homage to that. I have a previous part in the book where I'm talking about Antarctican farmers and then who are stuck out there just eking out an existence in the snow. And then here's the Antarcticans after migration, where they are able to build a great modern city right out of the snow, but still. All right, so anyway, that's by the way, a great book for teaching little kids economics and technology, because it's a lot of details, like how do you make a road, right? It's actually complicated. It's not just pouring some pavement, right? There's other things you have to do. Okay, so the wealth of freedom. For the wealth of freedom, all right, so basic fact is that most people on Earth cannot live or work in the first world without government permission. Unless you happen to be born a citizen of the first world, which most people are not, then the only way that you are able to go and live and work here is if you get a piece of paper, or really a bunch of pieces of paper from the government. So any foreign-born people here right now? Yeah. So was it really easy to get in? Yeah. Yeah, pain in the neck. Worse than a pain in the neck? Yeah, so my wife got in from communist Romania when she was 7, but they were stuck in limbo in Italy for 6 months while the US government decided if they were spies. And then once they got here, she was a little kid, but she had to go down to the immigration office to do stuff for her parents because her parents were both desperately trying to make ends meet while they adapted to their new country. Anyway, so most people on Earth cannot live or work in the first world without government permission. And this permission is almost impossible for most people to obtain. Of course, the immigrants that you meet here, they generally did get that permission. But you have to consider all the people who weren't able to get that permission. So what is it you need to do in order to legally move to the US? So one is you can be really high skilled, or better yet, you can be legally classified as an immigrant of extraordinary talent. That's really hard. Again, that's like your Einstein types. All right. But you can do an H-1B for being high skilled, if you're lucky. Pull that off. If you have a close blood relative, or a close relative, it doesn't have to be blood, it could be by marriage, but a close relative in the U.S., then they may be able to get you in, depending upon the closeness. So if you are a minor under 16 and your parent's a citizen, then they can get you in. Right? There's no quota for that. Right? Everything else, there are quotas. So in principle, you can get in a sibling, but if your country has already sent a lot of other people, then you are way down the line. So right now for Mexico, I think it's like a 20-year wait to get a sibling in. All right, so it's a long wait. And then there's one other notable way you can legally get in, and that is literally to win the lottery. Because there is the diversity lottery, where you can go and apply, and if you win this lottery, you get in. But that is about as hard as it sounds, right? If you tell someone, well, you can save your business if you win the lottery tomorrow, that isn't normally to say, I have a great plan for you and this is going to work. Rather, you say you can save your business if you win the lottery is to say you basically haven't a prayer. All right. And so almost impossible for most people to obtain. And this is where I do stick my neck out. So you remember hearing about Jim Crow laws. So under Jim Crow laws in the South, did the law simply say that you may discriminate if you wish? Is that what Jim Crow laws said? No. What Jim Crow law said is you must discriminate whether you want to or not. You are required to discriminate. There are some areas where it is not legal to rent someone a home if they are black. There are some jobs where you can't legally employ them if they are black. All right, that's what Jim Crow is about. Right? And that is what immigration laws are about as well. It's not saying that you may discriminate against immigrants if you wish. It is saying that you must discriminate against them whether you want to or not. Right? By the way, so when I teach the economics of discrimination, I always like to go over laws that make it illegal to hire immigrants and to say, it's kind of interesting because it seems like there's a lot of animosity against illegal immigrants. Right? So this is one of the few groups that people will still denounce in line at the grocery store, and they don't look around their shoulder to make sure that there isn't anyone who will be offended by that. Right? And yet, even though there's a lot of animosity against illegal immigrants, people still think they'll be able to get jobs. That's kind of weird. So employers have animosity. They are not going to get sued if they discriminate against illegal immigrants. And yet, the law says that they can't do it. Strange. It almost sounds like employers would like to hire them even if they aren't that fond of them in order to make money. Right? And once you soak that in, it really is a mind-blowing insight. But in any case, now why does this matter economically? Well, over in the field of international trade, they have trade models where they try to estimate the harm of trade barriers. How much harm does a sugar tariff do? How much is lost to the world? All right. And when you go and apply these standard models to immigration, you get an astronomical number for the harm that is done to the world by virtue of keeping foreign labor out. Why? Because you've got, first of all, a huge price wedge. This means the difference between the wages for a shoe shiner in Haiti and in Miami is enormous. And if you go and work through the math in these trade models, they say that if you multiply the size of that wedge, the size of that price difference caused by the tariff, you multiply that by a factor of 10, you multiply the social loss by a factor of 100. Right? So the harm is proportional to the square of the barrier. All right, so if you haven't worried about squaring anything for a while, don't worry too much, but just, whatever double the wedge, quadruple the harm. Right? Think of it like that. All right. And the price wedge between foreign and domestic labor is enormous, often of 1,000%. And then you go and you multiply that loss per person times an enormous amount of people that are being kept out. So again, there's a lot of research saying hundreds of millions of people want to come to the first world, and you get a loss from this regulation on the order of 50% of the gross world product. All right, now wait, if we lost 50% of gross world product, why aren't we poor? Because we've lost something that we never had. In other words, we are foregoing enormous gains. So a flip side of this, if these regulations are reducing our wealth by 50%, it's saying deregulation would double our wealth, right? And of course, it's great to double the GDP of Luxembourg. Even that would be an amazing achievement. Has anyone here ever doubled the wealth of a country? No? Okay. But doubling the wealth of the world is a really amazing achievement. That is off the charts. And then here, this isn't me, this is economist Michael Clements, who did a lot of this research. But here you have Michael Clements as King Kong, right, climbing the Empire State Building. All right, and yes, so it says, let's put this in perspective. The world now produces about $75 trillion a year. Open borders could easily double this. Economically, open borders is like getting an extra 75 Manhattans a year. Estimated value of real estate in all of Manhattan is about $1 trillion, or it was when I wrote the book. Like getting 150 Googles a year. Market cap of Google was about $500 billion when I wrote the book. Like getting 375 million Ferraris a year. All right, so those are worth about 200,000. And then last one, 9 McDonald's Happy Meals a day per person. So there you have Michael Clements as a Happy Meal toy, which is about to happen, right? Soon. Okay. any day now. All right. Okay. So why not? So I was debating this at the Mont Pelerin Society, and now there is a set of arguments among libertarians along the lines of, I don't care about these economic effects. We own this country. It is our private property, and we can do whatever we want with it, and we have chosen to not let people in. All right, and that is an interesting argument for a libertarian to make, because if you believe that, then you should also cease your opposition to every other regulation that exists. Because we're allowed to not let people into our house if we don't want them, right? So we don't have to let immigrants in, right? All right, interesting. All right, so are you allowed to stop someone from setting up a church in your house? Sure, all right, then our country's allowed to say what religions can be practiced here. Are you allowed to say that you can't go and denounce me in my own house? Yeah, all right, fine, then we can have laws saying that you can't say things that are against the government, and so on, right? And again, how about free trade? Yeah, well, are you allowed to open a store in my house without permission? No. Well, then why should anyone be allowed to open a store in America without the permission of America? All right, now, what's wrong with this argument? Well, what's wrong with this argument is it is actually not only not building on a libertarian premise, it is building on a hardcore socialist premise that countries are the collective property of their citizens. And if you believe that, then you should just stop being a libertarian. Because it is exactly the opposite of libertarianism to think that countries are the collective property of their citizens. If you think that, then any complaint you have against any government policy is just a matter of prudence. You say, well, we don't have to do this, but it is not there is no longer any possibility of a principled objection if it is our collective property. All right, and how about this? Can government say how many kids you're allowed to have? Well, if you're living in my house, can you go and have a baby and live with a baby without my permission? No, you can't. I can decide who has babies under my roof. So therefore, government has the right to decide who has kids. Don't like it, get out. All right, yeah, so in the book, I do have Vladimir Lenin saying, love it or leave it. So I did have fun putting that into his mouth. All right, now, so anyway, that is the crummy argument against open borders from a libertarian point of view, because while it does use the language of property, it reverses the whole presumption of private property in favor of collective property. All right. Now, what are the good arguments? So I'll say the best critics, the reasonable people. They'll say, yes, of course we agree that there is a presumption against government regulation of immigration. Of course, it's the kind of thing that you would need a rationale for. But there happens to be a good rationale. So while there isn't any good rationale for preventing people from using heroin, but there is a good rationale for stopping people from moving here unless the government allows it. So, and what are some of these objections? So one big one that you get from libertarians is just fiscal harm. So immigrants are going to come and go on welfare and rip us off. Another one that you're more likely to get, not just from conservatives, just from a lot of people actually, is cultural harm. There's some kind of way in which they are diluting or otherwise damaging our culture. And then finally, another one that libertarians will often say is that immigrants are going to come here and they're going to take away our freedom. They're going to go and vote to make our country like the countries that they got the hell out of, right? And well, why would they do that? Because they don't know what messed their country up. All they know is that our country is nicer than their country, but it won't be for long if they start voting for the same policies. Now, the main hurdle that all of these arguments face is this. the estimated cost of immigration restrictions is huge. So 50% of the gross world product is not a small sum. It is about as big a number as the human mind can comprehend, which means that when you are trying to find arguments in favor of regulation, you need to get things in that same ballpark. So you need to get multi-trillion-dollar problems before you could even begin to have a sensible argument against, right? And whenever you are thinking about this, it's always worthwhile just to remember some very basic numeracy. All right, so what is the approximate value of 1 trillion minus 1 billion? Rounding. Approximate value of a trillion minus a billion is? A trillion. Yes. So, well, what if I have like $1,000 million problems? All right, it's like, well, $1,000 million problems, that's just a billion. Right? So, yeah, but I've listed so many problems. How can you be so unreasonable in not going and changing your mind? Well, what if all your problems are small change by comparison to the benefits of what we would be giving up? All right. And here I do go through these problems here. So, yeah, we've got the fiscal ship sinking. We've got the Tower of Babel. And then we have what Zach and I call the Rainbow Coalition of Jerks. So here we have, the white nationalists, the radical Islamists, the person who hates freedom. We've got the socialists. All right, so all the different people are going to come and take away our freedom. Right. All right. Now, starting with protecting taxpayers. So how many people have ever heard that Milton Friedman said, quote, "You cannot simultaneously have free immigration and a welfare state," end quote? Yes, I have had multiple people quoting this back to me on Twitter as a refutation of the book, saying, well, gee, Milton Friedman says it in the book. He's right there in the book telling me this, so I am aware of the argument. I do have a chapter on it, so yes, fine point, interesting objection, but it's not unknown to me. All right, and the simple story is this. The American welfare state does pay more for idleness than many countries pay for work, and that's absolutely true. All right, so the standard of living on someone in the U.S. on welfare is enough to make the typical Haitian drool with envy. All right, and then the next step is, so obviously a lot of immigrants are going to come to abuse the system. Now that is quite a bit less clear because it's like, yeah, well, but once you're here, you aren't going to be comparing welfare to the wages in your home country. You'll probably be comparing welfare here to work here. Right? But in any case, this is the kind of question, though, that is highly empirical. Right? So a lot of people think that they can figure out the numbers in the budget in their heads through intuition. And if there is anything for which human intuition is not suited, it is that. Right? Going over complicated financials of an entire budgetary system, most of which people don't even understand the basics of, it's really hard to do that. How are you supposed to do it? By getting boring and sitting down and looking at a bunch of numbers, or you can also rely upon the division of labor and find the careful, boring people who have done this careful, boring work, and then go and read it through. And of course, you don't want to just read things that agree with you, which I made a strong effort not to do. All right. Now, key fact about the U.S. welfare state, this is actually true for all known welfare states, is that they focus a lot more on the old than the poor. So once you know this does just tip the scales towards maybe immigrants aren't going to be a burden, because though immigrants, especially the ones we don't let in right now, would probably be poor, they're also likely to be young. And so then, all right, well, poor but young. Where does the math work out on that? Right? Anyway, so the upshot of this is that when you actually go over and do the work, and again, so if you trust me, great, then what I'm telling you is true. Believe me. All right. If you don't, then all I can say is check the references. I tried to do a very careful job and not go and only read people that agreed with me, but rather find the highest quality, most prestigious sources. So anyway, the upshot is that almost no serious researcher finds a big negative fiscal effect of immigration. Right. So in the book, rely heavily upon the National Academy of Sciences estimates from a couple of years ago. So, and here are the numbers that they get. Now, by the way, these numbers are the good kind of numbers. So they don't just look at the immediate fiscal effect of an immigrant. They don't just look at the taxes that an immigrant pays the year they arrive minus the services they consume the year they arrive. Instead, of course, you want to go and get a longer time horizon. And furthermore, it would be cheating to ignore the fact that immigrants are going to have kids. Right? So you want to take into account, well, if they're 25, they may not have kids now, but then they'll have kids. Those kids are going to be getting school 5 years after that. you want to put that stuff in. All right. But then, once you're doing that, then you want to say, but then the kids grow up and eventually they pay taxes, so we want to put that in. Right? So that's why these are estimates. Right? These are things that haven't happened yet, but nevertheless, there are better and worse ways of doing those kinds of estimates. All right, so what does the National Academy of Sciences say? First result. For the immigrants that we receive now, the average fiscal effect is a substantial net positive of plus $58,000. Okay. Then they go and look, how about immigrants who only have high school degree? Then they come up with a lower number, plus 49,000. All right, then you look at high school dropout foreigners, high school dropout immigrants. That's where they come up with a negative number of negative 117,000. All right, but then you go and break it down by age, and then they find that even low-skilled immigrants are still a fiscal positive as long as they are young. So really, Friedman's argument comes down to saying, look, low-skilled elderly people are a burden. Right? And as I say in the book, right, so that does seem to be true, but then where is this cannot coming from? It's one thing if the typical person coming would be a burden. But if it's a matter of one particular demographic, the low-skilled elderly ones, like, can you go and have open immigration for everyone, even though one out of many of the demographics is a fiscal negative? Right? And I say you totally can. And then I have an argument with Milton Friedman about whether or not the fact that some babies are likely to be a burden on taxpayers is a reason to restrict human reproduction. Right? And yeah, so anyway, that's a fun part of the book. I got the babies yelling at Milton, but all right. Okay. Now, finally, if you think these numbers are absurd, like, how are we getting these good numbers? How can someone who earns below the median American salary be a net positive for the U.S. Treasury? Right? And the answer is that built into these numbers is the fact that a lot of government spending is what economists call non-rival, meaning that the cost of the government service does not vary with the population, or at least increases less proportionately with population. So whatever your views on foreign policy are, there's probably a lot of unusual views here, I'm guessing, but whatever those views are, if we had a new baby boom, there's 30 million new American babies, who would say, now that we have all these babies, we need to expand the nuclear arsenal to take care of them? Right? That would be a bizarre thing to say, because you can defend those babies just as well when the military exists. Right? So very often, letting in a lower-skilled immigrant is like letting in someone for reduced price at a matinee at a movie theater. Do movie theaters lose money by having cheap tickets at matinees? No, they don't. Could they stay in business if everyone paid the matinee price? They probably couldn't. But you can still make money by letting in someone who pays more than they cost, even though what they're paying is less than the typical amount. All right, then we have protecting American culture. So here I get to have an argument with Socrates, who's a stand-in for a number of other smart, but to my mind, angry and innumerate people that I have talked to. Right, so it's not quite my dad. My dad isn't Socrates, but in any case. The complaint says immigrants are destroying American culture. So now the problem with this cultural complaint is it's hard to know exactly what it means. We can start off with the most measurable kinds of culture, like language acquisition, and there's a lot of research on that. But then you might say, no, I didn't mean language. I meant something else. And then you can say, all right, fine. How about measured trust in the social science literature? We could do that one. Or we could go and look at things like intermarriage rates. Right? So there's a lot of different measures of culture that we can do, although if someone just says, no, culture is none of the things that you talk about. Culture is a je ne sais quoi. All right, well, I can't refute the je ne sais quoi, because it's something I cannot name, but it is there. All right, but what I can say is if people have made a bunch of testable claims and they're wrong, and then they have some other untestable claims, I think it is reasonable when a person has just shown they have a poor track record for reliability for things where we can evaluate them, to not take their complaints about things where we can't evaluate them too seriously. All right, so now, for the linguistic complaint, there is great data, and what the data says is that it is just not true that immigrants used to learn English and don't now. The real story, rather, is that first-generation immigrants, if they come as adults, have always struggled to acquire fluency because it's really hard. Right, so go the Ellis Island generation, if you're showing up from Sicily when you're 30, you probably never speak fluent English. And it's the same today. But then how did we wind up teaching English to the immigrants? The answer is it's their kids who acquired fluency. That was true then and remains totally true today. Then why is there all these big Spanish areas of town, but there's no German areas of town? Because Germany stopped sending many immigrants. So if only the first generation immigrants are not fluent, and then the immigrant flow largely stops, then after a couple generations, the first generation immigrants are dead. And then they no longer have their own area. But it doesn't mean that there's a difference in language acquisition. Whereas for Spanish-speaking immigrants, the US keeps having new waves of first-generation immigrants, and that's why we are maintaining this level of Spanish. All right, now, one of the most common complaints that I get from people, especially angry people on social media, is they say, look, Bryan is, well, how many insults? All right, so idiot, Aspie's a big one, all right? Right, so I have done Facebook polls, so like, if you know me in real life, how Aspie am I really? Which I admit is a kind of Aspie thing to do, but nevertheless, people who know me well say, only a little bit above average, but not, nothing that would stand out, should I just say, all right? All right, but anyway, so common complaint is, look, people like Bryan, they think that our country is made of magic dirt. So you go and you take Attila the Hun and you paradrop him into the US, and there he is, this vicious barbarian, and he touches the soil. And then Attila becomes an American. And he then suddenly loses his interest in hacking people to pieces and crushing his enemies, and then goes and gets a job at Smashburger or something like that. All right, so magic dirt, widely ridiculed view, and what I say is, look, I don't believe in this magic dirt. I don't think that just touching the soil transform people. Rather, I say what we have in rich countries is magic culture. We have magic culture. We have a whole set of cultural values and incentives which, when combined, allow two things. First of all, people adults who arrive from even the most backwards and authoritarian countries are able to adjust enough to become productive members of society. Right? That's the first thing that we do. So you can take someone who has never seen a store before, doesn't know electricity, and within a modest amount of time, they can go and do at least some basic jobs and get by and become self-supporting. Secondly, the other thing magic culture does is it takes the kids of Attila the Hun and it turns them into regular Americans. Right? And this is my story. Anyway, now in the book I then go over, well, maybe that's overly optimistic. Could that be wrong? Just to me, the idea that the second generation immigrants are really different from people who grew up in this country is just so crazy. It's like, how can you think that? How many second generation immigrants do you know? As I say in the book, my wife speaks Romanian with an American accent, not English with a Romanian accent, right? And she'd never heard English until she was 7 years old, right? And they didn't speak English in the home either. But still, just by virtue of growing up in this country, she has fluent English because she arrived in time. Okay. Now, finally, another point that I make in the book is that people often think of assimilation as something that doesn't work as well as it did in the past. So if you know who, I feel like I'm going over a little bit. Let me just double check that. Let's see. Yeah, so I'm supposed to go to what, 115? Well, I got to 1. Okay, all right, great. Okay, good. Then I don't have to rush. Okay. Yeah, so the head of the Center for Immigration Studies, which is the most prominent anti-immigration think tank in the world, is run by a guy named Mark Krikorian, right? And Mark Krikorian, I've done several debates with him, and he has a story. He says, look, immigration is like donuts. I think immigrants are like donuts. I'm like, how are immigrants like donuts? And he says, well, look, when you're young, you can stuff your face with donuts, and what happens to you? Nothing. You stay your wonderful, fit, attractive self while you fill your mouth with donuts day after day. It's fine. But if you're 50 and you keep stuffing your face with donuts, you will be morbidly obese and probably die of an early heart attack. Similarly, he says, when the country was young, we could stuff our face with immigrants. It was fine. We were able to assimilate them back then. We could digest them. The country could digest immigrants in those days. We had a great metabolism. But now, if we tried doing what we did when we were a young country, it would kill us from a heart attack. All right, so it's like, all right, kind of an interesting metaphor. What does it really show? Well, what he's trying to say is that, well, back in the past we were good at assimilating people, and now we're not so good at assimilating people. All right. Now, what I tell him is, look, you're looking only for ways in which assimilation is worse than it used to be. Right? And it's true that 100 years ago you wouldn't be able to pick up a cell phone and talk to people in your home country. Right? So in that way, non-assimilation is easier than it used to be because of modern technology, modern communications and transportation. He said, but Mark, you should also think about ways that assimilation works better than it did in the past. And how would that be? Well, think about this. So 1900, Sicilian peasant comes to Ellis Island. He has probably never heard English in his life, has not had electricity, and then he shows up in Manhattan. What kind of culture shock is that? It's an enormous culture shock. On the other hand, where would you have to go in Italy now to find a guy like that who had never heard any English and never seen electricity? Right? So in the data we see we got something like 1 billion people who don't live in countries where English is the main language who still speak fluent English. This would have been very rare in the past, but because of the spread of Western culture all over the world, and especially American culture above all, the ideas and understanding about what life is like here and what our culture is like are now all over the world. So what I say is now, unlike in the past, we actually have a lot of pre-assimilated immigrants, people who are ready to hit the ground running, and probably many of you know people like this, where you're even surprised that they weren't born here, right, because they are so Americanized already. All right. Then we come to the argument that does speak most strongly to libertarians, and it just says, look, we got a freer country anyway. We're in one of the least unfree parts of the world right now, and you go and look at people in other countries, and like even if you're unhappy with the US, other countries generally look quite a bit less free. All right. And it says, look, well then why are these countries unfree? Well, probably because the people in the countries are statists. Right. So why is Venezuela a socialist country? Well, they voted for socialism a bunch of times. They didn't vote for this, but they voted for socialism nevertheless. They didn't vote for it to not work, but you can't actually vote for it to work. You can only vote to try it and see what happens. All right, but anyway, and so then the idea is then they'll come here, but they're not coming here, the story goes, for freedom. They're coming here for money, right? And there's a lot of people who love money even though they hate freedom. You may even know some of these people. They might even be in your family. Some money-loving, freedom-hating folk, right? They're around, all right? So, and then they show up here, and you might say, well, once they're here, aren't they going to ask the question, why is this country so much better than Venezuela, and reach the obvious answer of freedom did it? And maybe, maybe not. All right. So now here I summarize in what I call the master plan, and step 1 is flee hellhole of birth. Step 2 is get first world citizenship. Step 3 is vote hellhole party. And step 4 is repeat. All right. Now again, that sounds like I'm making fun, but I actually have a book, my first one called The Myth of the Rational Voter, where I say people often vote against their enlightened self-interest. In fact, my view is since every country that I know of has bad policies, including every democracy, every country is packed with voters who vote against their enlightened self-interest. Right? Isn't that arrogant? Yeah. What can I say? All right. That's my considered opinion, that every country's wrong and I'm at least more right than they are. Right? And now, good news, you guys are also probably more right than they are. So we're all, it's us against the world, but that's not as arrogant as me alone against the world, right? All right. Now, this is a problem where it's a bit aggravating because there's a lot of people who complain about how terrible immigrant voters are, but there's very little in the way of data or public opinion research that people have done. So this is one where, in order to answer it, I have to largely do the critics' work for them. And then this is a thankless task because I can do the work for them. And they say, well, of course you found that because you did it. I'm like, well, I wouldn't have had to have done it if you had done the work. Why is it you say things without checking whether they're true or not? But anyway, so I did do this. So public opinion is one of my specialties. And so I did go and do these comparisons. And here's what you can see in the US data. Non-natives are more socially conservative and economically liberal than natives. So that's true. All right, so one of the building blocks in this argument actually does check out. However, there is a big difference between a big difference and a small difference. So important quantitative work is not just to say, is there a difference, does it exist, but also to indicate its size. And what I say is the size of these belief gaps is actually quite slight. Quite slight. With the one exception of very low-skilled immigrants, the differences are notable. Not huge, but still notable. All right. All right, so that's just the facts. And a lot of what I try doing in this book is to be very forthcoming. And with any evidence that was contrary to the tenor of the argument, I tried to disclose it very clearly and just to be honest and also win credibility by virtue of honesty. Now, there are several times my editor saying, this is kind of undercutting your argument. Like, I know it's undercutting my argument, but it's true. So I'm going to say it anyway. Like, all right, takes all kinds here, oddball, right? But what we can say is that, so what can we say about the harm of this? So first of all, non-natives have low turnout, and this is especially true for the least educated. So while their views do concern me a little bit, the people that concern me the most also have the very least likelihood of trying to influence the system, even when they're allowed to vote. So for high school dropout foreigners who are illegally allowed to vote, they have about a 25% voter participation rate in presidential elections, which is about the lowest of any demographic group I've ever heard of. All right. And then a final point that I make, in the book there's more, but final point I'll make here, is suppose that all foreigners would come and vote to expand the welfare state. All right, just suppose that. Does that actually show the welfare state would get bigger, or that the public overall would become more in favor of expanding the welfare state? And actually, not only is it not necessarily true, but there is a body of research saying that it is not true. Why? This research says that a lot of the reason why people oppose a bigger welfare state is because they think the money is going to outgroups. Right? And a lot of the reason why they support it is they think the money is going to people like them. Hence the heyday of the Scandinavian welfare state. This is when everyone in Denmark is blonde. So, and when everyone is blonde, then people in Denmark can say, well, it doesn't matter how big our welfare state is because no Danish person would ever just take advantage of the system. We can rest assured that any Dane who takes the money really genuinely needs it and will work hard to get back on their feet so we can just give them all the money they ask for. This was the attitude of the Scandinavian welfare states when they were very ethnically homogeneous. And then they started letting in some immigrants who weren't blonde. And then, for almost the first time in the post-war history of these countries, people started saying, I don't know about them. I think that Somalians and Syrians, I think they might. They might go and try to abuse the system. Right? And there is a simultaneous expansion of the foreign-born population of these countries that traditionally have very large welfare states with not an elimination of the welfare state, but rather a curtailment, right? Which I think of as finally making some basic concessions to common sense, long overdue, right? So, and this is, of course, a standard story about why the U.S. welfare state is smaller than the European one, is precisely because we do have more heterogeneity, right? So there's a book called Why Americans Pay Welfare that pursues this argument. Now, people often summarize this as saying it's because of racism we don't have a big welfare state. I said, no, that's overstating it. Really what it is that in the U.S. we have a less exaggerated sense of we are a national family and we all are brothers and sisters, which I will say is a very dangerous idea for human freedom, to think we're all brothers and sisters, because if your brothers and sisters are hurting themselves, can you just stand by and let them do it? No, you must save them, right? Whereas if a adult who is not a relative, a stranger, is doing something you don't approve of, that's where it's easier to control yourself and say, well, don't approve of it, but here's his life, right? So, just think about how much freedom would your parents give you to make choices they consider unwise? It's been now. Me? I'm on board, but not many people. And even there, I'm like, well, look, yeah, when you're 18, you can do what you want, but don't expect me to pay for a penny of anything I disagree with, kid. All right, I probably won't go that far, but all right. Okay, so then this brings me to the end here. So just, wasn't actually planning that the book would be coming out right around the time of the 30th anniversary of the Berlin Wall coming down, but so it did, and yes, we do have some Berlin Wall shots. So I've got open borders won't destroy our freedom. It's going to bring freedom to all mankind. Now, just last point here. A lot of people hate this analogy. And they say, look, there's all the difference in the world between building a wall to keep people in and keep people out. And it's like, all right, so suppose that it was the West German government that went and built a wall around East Germany, and they shot people for trying to get in. Would that have been that much better? Would it really have been such a difference? Right? And Ian might say that this distinction between a wall built to people in or out, it all comes back to this idea that the country is your collective property and you can do what you want with your own property. And again, that is an idea that is the antithesis of what you need for a free society. Because yes, if the country is collectively owned by the people there, then they are well within their rights to tell everyone in that country how to live, what business they can do, and on and on. All right, so I will stop there. Thanks a lot.